It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. The Marc Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Marc is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Marc Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. Thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio and News Talk 104.1 FM and 1600 AM at WEJS, broadcasting out of Williamsport. If you'd like to watch prior podcasts of the show or read any of my columns on Penn Live or to take a look at some great merchandise, including our popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt and the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard signs and T-shirts, go to the MarcScaringiShow.com website. And for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Well, as you know, we've been covering all things coronavirus-related over the past month, and much is happening and has happened at the state and national level since we last spoke. We have seen governors beginning to open up their states, including here in Pennsylvania. Governor Tom Wolf announced yesterday, May 1st, his plan to reopen Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about later in the show. Also, there has been considerable criticism of the governor's business waiver process, which has been closed by the governor for a couple of weeks now. You've heard state legislators and even the media criticize the waiver process as arbitrary and capricious, which is exactly what we argued in the case we filed in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and in the United States Supreme Court. Today, we'll have a very special guest, Pennsylvania's Auditor General Eugene DePasquale. He recently announced that he will conduct an audit of the governor's waiver program, and you will hear from him in the second segment of the show. But first, my opening statement. And here it is. Friends, the Attorney General of the United States of America, Bill Barr, recently said, "The Constitution is not suspended in times of crisis." Well, I regret to inform you that the Constitution has in fact been suspended in Pennsylvania. Governor Wolf issued an executive order unprecedented in the history of Pennsylvania and in the history of our country. Never before has a governor ordered the mass closure of tens of thousands of businesses for any reason, let alone because of a viral illness. Why not? Well, that's not the way our laws are supposed to work. Our laws do permit the governor to issue orders of mandatory medical testing, isolation, and quarantine, but only to those individuals infected with or likely exposed to a communicable disease. And even then, the governor needs to prove his case in court before he can take away a person's freedom. But in my opinion, this governor misused a law designed to respond to hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods to label our businesses disaster areas and to seal them off, not only from the public, but from the people who own and work in them. And our businesses are not disaster areas. The only disaster that has befallen Pennsylvania is the governor's decision to close tens of thousands of businesses and put over 1 million Pennsylvanians out of work. The governor's response to COVID-19 is probably the most irrational, unscientific, and biggest overreaction to a viral illness in the history of our country. And the results have been catastrophic. As you well know, we have over 1.5 million Pennsylvanians forced out of their jobs and having to file for unemployment compensation. We have roughly 1/5 of all of Pennsylvania's workers who are laid off and on unemployment compensation now. That could cost the state between $4 and $6 billion by the end of the next fiscal year. What about the UC for small business owners and independent contractors? They've been promised it. We've paid into the system our entire lives, and finally the government has decided to throw us a bone and let us collect. But where's the money? After about a month, small business owners and independent contractors still can't get their payments through the UC system. The economic destruction continues. The governor now projects we'll have a $5 billion budget deficit. And as we've talked about previously on this show, economists, including the former Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen, claim we're experiencing a 30 to 40% contraction in our gross domestic product. And this puts Pennsylvania at a level we haven't seen before since the pits of the Great Depression in terms of a devastating economic collapse. And I've argued much of this as the result of Tom Wolf's business closure order. Now, as you know, I've been fighting this order and fighting to reopen Pennsylvania since day one. I filed that emergency petition in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on behalf of several small business owners and asked the court to strike down the governor's order for violating their constitutional rights and the rights of business owners across Pennsylvania. Regrettably, the court denied our claims, and it even declared that you have no right to judicial review if your business was forcibly closed. That means you have no right to go to court to try to reopen your business. And I've argued we have judicial review in times of war. Why can't we have it during a viral illness? And the lieutenant governor, John Fetterman, claims he and the governor are leading with science. And my response is, well, let's take a look at the science. Johns Hopkins University of Medicine's Coronavirus Resource Center, as of April 13, they reported about 557,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the U.S. and 22,000 deaths. That's about 0.0% of America's 330 million population has been infected with coronavirus, and 0.007% have died from it. And Johns Hopkins reports that with more testing, the case-to-mortality ratio will be even lower. And you compare the coronavirus to influenza, and the Centers for Disease Control estimate that from October 1st of 2019 through April 4th of 2020, there were between 39 and 56 million cases of the flu, between 18 and 26 million medical visits, between 410,000 and 740,000 hospitalizations, and between 24,000 and 62,000 deaths due to the flu. And that death rate exists even though we have a flu vaccine. And my argument is those numbers can be considered as staggering as the infection and death toll count for COVID-19, but we don't shut down tens of thousands of businesses and lay off millions of workers because of the flu. And what about this science being promoted by our Secretary of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine? She has declared, remember just a few days before that historic rally to reopen Pennsylvania we had at the state capitol about 2 weeks ago, she announced the doubling of Pennsylvania's death count. Well, how did it double? Well, she added probable and possible deaths related to COVID-19 to the count. And our argument is that possible and probable means they're not sure, but they'll just label them as COVID-19 deaths anyway. And by the way, in the cases of probable and possible COVID-19 related deaths, no test was taken. So we're still labeling them as COVID-19 deaths without a COVID-19 test having been taken, let alone the patient testing positive for it. And we argue that's not accurate. That's not science driven. And some have claimed that perhaps the secretary has changed the manner in which she counts the deaths to support the governor's policy of closing down our schools, businesses, and forcing us to stay at home. You know, the Pennsylvania Department of Health on April 16th, it revealed that nearly 80% of Pennsylvanians who've contracted COVID-19 reside in only 10 of its 67 counties, and that's up in the Northeast and Southeast, as you well know by now. And over half, actually, a more recent Department of Health report has come out saying that about 70% of COVID-19 deaths have occurred in Pennsylvania's nursing homes and personal care facilities. That is a very high number. And you could say an overwhelming majority of deaths have occurred in our nursing homes and our personal care facilities. And we are arguing, well, a rational scientific response then would have been to target prevention and mitigation efforts there to the demographics and in the geographical areas where the risk is, and it's not to declare every square foot of Pennsylvania a disaster area. And as you know, there have been considerable concerns and complaints about the governor's business waiver process, which, by the way, is now shut down, has been for about 2 weeks. So if you're a small business owner and you missed the deadline, you're out of luck. You're still shut down if you're in one of those counties that are still in the red. Well, we're all still in the red until May 8th. So the waiver process itself has generated a lot of criticism that it's arbitrary and capricious. Those are legal terms, but arbitrary is a common sense term. I think we all understand that. Governor Wolf's former family business, Wolf Home Products, got a waiver, It sells kitchen cabinets. I'm not so sure how life-sustaining kitchen cabinets are, but, perhaps in the mind of the governor, they are. When media reports came out revealing the waiver was granted to Wolf Home Products, the governor changed his mind and rescinded the order, and it went away. It went back on the non-life sustaining list, but the CEO said, we don't care. We never needed that waiver in the first place. We're staying open. So that was one prime example that caused a lot of Pennsylvanians to have concern about the arbitrariness of the business waiver process. We've heard from state legislators criticizing it, and we also now have our state auditor general who has expressed his concern about the business waiver process and how he wants to undertake an audit to look into it and to see if improvements can be made to the program if in the event in the future it ever is utilized again. I hope it never is utilized again, and that's one of the things we're suing for in the United States Supreme Court. But if a future governor, if it stays in place, if it's not struck down, the future governor utilizes it, we certainly want it to be much more reasonable and rationally related to the purposes in place. So we're going to take a brief commercial break, and then when we get back, we're going to get State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale on the line, and we're going to talk with him about his audit of Governor Tom Wolf's business waiver process. So stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Now, more of Marc Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show. We're talking about Governor Wolf's business closure order, his plan to reopen Pennsylvania, and the waiver process he employed to determine whether or not businesses could reopen. And we have a special guest with us this afternoon. We have Eugene DePasquale, the State Auditor General. Auditor General DePasquale began his second term as Pennsylvania's 51st Auditor General back on January 17th of 2017. He presides over the department. He's our chief fiscal watchdog, responsible for using his audits to ensure that all state money is spent legally and properly, and to improve government accountability, transparency, and the effective use of taxpayer dollars. His list of accomplishments is too long to list. I will point out, though, his audits have identified more than $1 billion in misspent or potentially recoverable state money. He eliminated his department's 244 car fleet, so he put his money where his mouth is, and he worked hard to fix the state's child abuse hotline, the Child Line, where more than 58,000 calls went unanswered before his audit. He also went to law school with me. Mr. DePasquale tutored me and taught me everything I know about constitutional law. So if my lawsuit against the governor fails in the United States Supreme Court, there may be some blame to spread around. What do you think? Good afternoon, State Auditor General.
Hey, Marc, how you doing? I can see the political mail pieces flying now.
Well, we're so glad to have you on the show, and we appreciate you taking
Thanks for
the time.
having me.
So, yes, and let me just give a few basic facts about the waiver process, and I'd like you to get in here and talk about your audit, how you structured it, how you intend for it to be unrolled, maybe some timelines, and then we'll go from there. But just about the time I filed my lawsuit last Monday in the United States Supreme Court, according to the Department of Community and Economic Development, it had received about 42,000 waivers by the time the waiver process ended. And by that time, DCED had approved about 7,837 requests for a waiver, rejected 18,746, found about 14,000 didn't require one for the activity they wanted to perform, and the remainder were still being processed. So those are just some brief facts about the waiver process. And Eugene DePasquale, our State Auditor General, why did you decide to undertake this audit?
Well, thanks, Marc, for having me on, and hope you and your family are doing well. Well, a couple things. As this pandemic broke, I certainly met with my team. Obviously, we did, after the Capitol area was vacated, most of it was remote. And I said, look, there's going to be a lot of stuff happening during this pandemic. I want us to continue to keep our eyes and ears open for things that we're going to have to monitor to make sure that it's working right during the process, maybe things that we will need to analyze after. And right from the get-go, this was one that sort of kept popping as the one that had the most complaints about it, which was the business waiver program. Again, whether, there's other issues that people had broader complaints about, but where my specific jurisdiction came in that I felt we could have an impact. Then we began to debate the timing of when when that was to take place. And my initial instinct was to go when a lot of the emergency orders were lifted, because I didn't want to interfere with the pandemic response. Like now the waiver process is shut down. Certainly Senate Republicans have weighed in. The governor's office itself weighed in. So I thought I thought it was appropriate to begin this audit on Thursday.
Okay. And you've said that some business owners complained that the department's waiver process was too slow and not transparent enough. So one would assume you're going to look into the transparency and the expediency by which, or the lack thereof, by which DCED reviewed these waivers.
I'll start off with, we're going to be as comprehensive as humanly possible. We're not only going to look at those issues, so we're going to request all the documentation. Look, at some point, we'll probably have to do a statistical sampling of who was felt didn't need the waiver, who was denied, and who got it. And I'll work that out with my team. But we will get enough of whether we're going through every single line or doing enough of a statistical sampling to get a flavor of this. One thing we need to find out is, for starters, were the companies that were granted a waiver and the ones that were denied, was that a fair process? Meaning, were they, regardless of whether they had a lobbyist or not, whether they had a special connection or not, whether it was just Mon Pa Diner, and I don't want to get into naming every business name, but was that process fair? And it doesn't mean you had to get the waiver or being denied was unfair, but making sure that process was fair and consistent, so that if, again, building type A was granted a waiver and somebody in that same classification was denied a waiver, we're going to seek explanation as to why the discrepancy exists. And one of my concerns, and again, the audit will bear it out, but this is, I've been public about a concern about this, and that is there was a call center. There were different people reviewing online submissions. We're all human beings. Well, governors have the right to set policies, legislatures have the right to write laws, and we all know there's negotiations on budgets. But once the process or the policy is set in place, whether we agree or disagree with the policy, once that's in place, businesses doing their best to follow that policy need to be treated fairly. And one thing I want to make sure didn't happen, and again, I'm going to be open-minded about it, is if you called in and call center person B answered the phone versus call center person D or F or whatever, was the response different based on who answered the phone? And I know there's always a supervisor, but we all know if the person answering the phone submits up to their supervisor with a recommendation, a lot of times that recommendation is followed, especially something that and I don't even mean this to be critical, the time crunch and chaos that was surrounding all the COVID issues, that I don't know how much time supervisors were even using to met out those type of differences. So hopefully you get to what I'm trying to make sure is that there was consistency and fairness. Then we want to go at another thing we're going to examine is there is a national model on this type of issue that the governor chose to go in a different path, in a sense to make some changes from the national model. Now, there are people that will tell you the national model was better. Some people will tell you the Wolf model was better. What I want to get at also is, we can examine that. If, again, as Auditor General, I don't get to make policy, but we will, try to make some determination of was the governor's model or the national model flawed, and maybe make some recommendations on that. But again, they don't have to follow those recommendations. One of the things I'll try to see is what were the differences between the national model and what the Wolf administration used, and why were those changes made? Again, maybe entirely appropriate reasons, maybe reasons that you and I would agree with, maybe reasons you and I would have disagreements, or maybe we'd both think, oh, okay, we both disagree with this. But I want to know why those changes were made. And so from there, the fairness, equity of the system, of people seeking the waiver, whether they got it or not, and why were those differences from the national model? That's where we're going to start. And then a lot of information will flow from there.
And to my listeners, we're talking with State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale, and he's talking to us about his audit process that he's going to be undertaking, auditing Governor Tom Wolf's or DCED's business waiver process, which is now closed. And our Auditor General is saying now is the time to conduct a review to determine whether or not the processes used were fair and transparent and equitable. And, Eugene, you're talking about the national model. are you referring to the Department of Homeland Security, the
Yes.
agency CISA, the cybersecurity agency?
That's correct. Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. Yes,
Okay.
I'm referring to the Department of Homeland Security's in a sense, and a lot of states were using that model, and the Wolf administration went in a different direction. Again, he's the governor; they can set policies within frameworks. But I know that is a debatable issue. I just want to get at, because again, I'm not the governor, I'm not the legislature. We don't get to set policy here, but I do want to examine why those changes were made.
Yeah, and one of the points that we made in our case, and I'm going to have to speak very quickly because we're readily running out of time, and I know your time is very limited today, and I thank you for being here, is we talked about how that federal model talked about how real estate services are essential, and our governor stated he was maintaining consistency with that federal agency recommendation, yet we still have real estate agents who are, the entire real estate services industry is still considered to be non-life sustaining and thus closed unless you got a waiver. So that will be one area that you can start your examination of.
And you can imagine the complaints we got about that. And again, one is defined as critical, one is life sustaining. We all know something could be critical and not life sustaining, because a lot of these things are how you define it. But there's a reason why a shift was made. My job is to ask the question, why was the shift made?
Oh, that's terrific that you're examining that. That's something that we talked about in our lawsuit. We're not so sure what non-life sustaining and life sustaining mean. The governor's definitions are circular. Life sustaining means, according to the governor, a business that is life sustaining during a pandemic. Well, you're defining the definition with itself, and so how do you determine what standards then to employ in reviewing those waivers? It can be anything or nothing. It's so broad, and hopefully you'll get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, and that's part of my job. And when I say my job, obviously our whole team that'll be part of this audit is, we start off with asking, okay, was there a definition of life sustaining? Again, you and I may disagree with what that definition is, but we got to start off how was the definition of life sustaining? Because we can all have our own opinion about what that means. But if you're not working off a consistent definition, that's how you then would get caller B gets a different answer than caller D.
Right.
And that's what we can't have. Again, we can the whole process is people out there that don't think we should have even had the process. That's not my job to weigh in on that, although I certainly have my opinions. But really, my bigger concern is what were we working off a consistent definition of life sustaining? Why were the changes from the Department of Homeland Security model made into the state model? And were there any differences or lack of consistency on people calling in? All of those are, I think, very important issues. Again, someone could say, and understandably so, hey, look, that won't change anything now. We want to make sure, look, as Auditor General, I can only audit something after it's done. That's just the good and bad with the job. But I do know that this may happen again, and we can't simply put our economy entirely on ice for 2 months and have that be a sustainable model moving forward if, God forbid, this ever happens again.
Well, State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale, I'm certainly happy and glad that you're taking a look at this, and I'm sure tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of Pennsylvanians are glad as well that you're taking a look and you're performing an audit on the business waiver process. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule today. We appreciate it.
You got it, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Best to all your listeners, and I'll see you soon, hopefully in person someday soon.
All right, Eugene, thank you. We're going to take a brief commercial break. You're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show. We'll be back right after this.
Now back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting Pennsylvania and America first, and also our Constitution. The Constitution plays a foundational role in our civilization and our society. And regrettably, as I talked about during my opening statement, it has been suspended in Pennsylvania during this period of the COVID-19 viral illness. We so very much hope that the Constitution makes a dramatic return to Pennsylvania. we shall see how that lawsuit develops. We also heard from our state auditor general, Eugene DePasquale, who is hard on the job and taking a close look and examination of the business waiver process to determine whether it was conducted fairly, efficiently. He is comparing the standards employed by the personnel at Pennsylvania's Department of Community and Economic Development to the standards and recommendations of the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, C-I-S-A. Of course, it's a federal agency, so it includes all kinds of acronyms and abbreviations and such. And we were talking with Mr. DePasquale about one particular point and regarding real estate agents and how they have been on the governor's non-life sustaining list since the very inception of the business closure order, much to the chagrin of tens of thousands of real estate agents and those and many thousands of others, Pennsylvanians, who support real estate agents and who are part of the greater real estate services industry, and how regrettably they have been closed down since the beginning, and how housing is critically important to life. Life-sustaining is the definition the governor has chosen to determine whether or not waivers are accepted or denied. But apparently housing, finding new housing, selling one's house are not life-sustaining according to the governor. And Mr. DePasquale will have his work cut out for him as we discuss that standard, that life-sustaining standard. It's a tough one because it's so broad and vague and really can mean whatever you want it to mean, which is why we have beer distributorships being determined to be life-sustaining, candy shops, pet stores, life-sustaining. Really? Well, perhaps beer distributorships are. No, I say that in jest, but so he'll have his work cut out for him because he's trying to examine the work done by the DCED personnel in reviewing these waivers and rendering decisions, but based upon what? Based upon a standardless standard. It's going to be difficult to determine the quality of the work when the overarching standard employed is really not able to be understood and thus utilized properly. I think what really occurred in the decision-making process of these waivers is whether or not the business could be conducted in such a way that does not increase the spread of COVID-19. I think that's probably the practical standard that was employed, but that is not the announced standard because certainly they did grant waivers to some real estate agents, brokerage firms that requested them, and certainly real estate could not be non-life sustaining on Monday, but life-sustaining on Wednesday. No, really, it was the granting of the waiver on Tuesday. And in the waiver, the brokerage firm would have explained how they can conduct their work in a way that is safe in these times of the COVID-19 viral illness. So I think, practically speaking, the standard that was probably utilized is can the business operate in such a way that doesn't increase the risk of the spread of the viral illness? And our argument from the beginning is if the government's going to take an action in the area of the viral, of trying to prevent the spread of a communicable disease, which we believe it does have the power and authorities to do so, just not that power and authority does not include the closure of businesses and legal entities. But as you know, we've made that argument in the courts. But if it does have that power, it should be one that is rationally related to achieving its goal, and it should be balanced. It should be balanced with the public interest in not only having a communicable disease spreading throughout the community, which we don't want, but the public also has an interest in maintaining jobs and maintaining employment and maintaining income. That's pretty darn important. Those are some of the foundational principles of our community. They talk about trying to prevent community spread of a viral illness, but then they shut down all the businesses, not just in the community, but in the state. And that's not advocating public interest, in my view. It seems in the reopening plan, and by the way, as you know, the governor has he announced on Friday that he is reopening Pennsylvania starting on Friday, May 8th. He is going to be reopening 24 counties in the northwest and north central regions of the state, moving them from red to yellow, beginning at 12:01 a.m. Friday, May 8th. As you know, the governor has announced a 3-color coded system: red, yellow, and green. And when you're in the red, you're closed. When you're in the yellow, you're somewhere in between. And when you're green, you're open. But with COVID-19 protocol precautions in place. The governor reserves the right to move an area, a region, or a county, it seems, from red to yellow and yellow to green, but then also back again from green to yellow and yellow to red, if the governor determines that the viral illness is continuing to spread. So is it a reopening? Possibly. With the potential that there could be a reclosing. And it's interesting to me that if you read the governor's reopen plan, he talks about that he's balancing economic benefits. I guess that means our jobs, our places of employment. He's balancing economic benefits and public health risks. So it looks like now the governor is employing the balancing test that for over a month we've been asking him to do or decrying why he didn't do when on March 19th he issued the statewide business shutdown, which obviously did not balance any economic benefits with the public health risks. It was just a statewide economic shutdown. And by the way, you're welcome to call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Call into the Marc Scaringi Show and let me know what you think about the governor's reopen plan. As you know, we heard from State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale just minutes ago talking about his audit of the governor's business waiver process. And I believe we have a caller. We have Jay from Boiling Springs. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, Jay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
The sad thing was people who had tried to apply for a waiver and waited 6 weeks and then got a letter back that said 14,000 people, they could have been working all along. That definitely doesn't make those people that, it's sort of like the government's looking at them was, it was your fault you weren't working in the first place. But it wasn't their fault. It was the process. And the other thing is that I would like to mention, once the governor seen that Pennsylvania had a higher percentage of unemployment than any other state, that should have been something to wake him up and say, why? And I think Eugene needs to address that. When you have numbers like that hitting you in the face, there's got to be a reason, and that reason was because we didn't follow what the other states did.
Very good points, Jay from Boiling Springs. I think you hit the nail right on the head. I want to thank you for calling. I've got to take a brief commercial break. You're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Let's get back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We have been very much talking about constitutional conservatism, conservative policies from our governor. We wish we had policies that adhered to our Constitution. We wish we had. Jay from Boiling Springs makes the point that Pennsylvania has the largest unemployment, the highest number of unemployment claims in the country. We are leading in that area, and that is regrettable and shameful. And the governor has made a tragic mistake in his mass business closure order. Will he ever admit to that mistake or recognize that mistake? I doubt that very much. But we'll open the phone lines. We'll take some more calls. We have Doug from Hershey. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Hi, long-time listener. Hey, I got a question, or making a point, I guess, and then I got a question for you. Do you think it's...
Sure.
I think this is all motivated by getting more taxes, or what do you think? That's my question then to you.
Yeah, I don't think that actually. I've worked in politics I did formerly worked in politics for many, many years in the U.S. Senate and in the Attorney General's office, campaigns and elections. And I have drawn the conclusion that politicians will react to a crisis in a way that is typically irrational, unreasonable, and in some cases hysterical.
So you think it's all a power grab?
I don't necessarily believe it was all intended to be a power grab. It has resulted in the largest power grab in the history of Pennsylvania. But no, I think that Governor Wolf saw what was happening with the spread of the disease, watched the hysterical media reports of the spread of the disease, watched governors in his sister states, including namely Andrew Cuomo in New York, watched them take these draconian actions and saw them as exhibiting leadership. Governors act, and when you act, you look like a leader. Now, the actions have been catastrophically wrong to any reasonable person, but that's not the way they're viewed in the media and among those who support the governor and the government and its apparatus. So I think that's what pushed him to do what he did. He wanted to look like he was acting decisively in the face of a pandemic. The problem is everything he did was wrong and has harmed Pennsylvania greatly economically. The stay-at-home and business closure orders have put the healthy at risk. You don't quarantine the healthy. It's lowered our immune system so that when the quarantine is lifted, we'll have a greater chance of contracting a communicable disease. So it's wrong according to economics. It's wrong according to science. It's wrong according to the law. But he looks decisive and bold. He looks like a leader, right?
Right. Okay. I see it now. What your viewpoints are.
That's my honest
thank
answer.
You, sir. You have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, Doug from Hershey. Thanks for calling. We have time for Richard from Mechanicsburg. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope to see you at the PLC when that's scheduled again. 3 questions. One, deprivation of rights under color of law and the penalties therefor. Also, the penalties for violation of one's oath of office. And the third one would be something we talked about a long time ago, and maybe it's appropriate right now, quo warranto.
Well,
any thoughts?
Good. Yeah. Well,
because I couldn't think of a better time, and having worked for the Attorney General, as I heard in your talks earlier, I don't know if you saw any of this come through or not, because there was a few running in Pennsylvania, there's a few running across the country.
Yeah, Richard,
yeah.
I have done and am continuing to do everything I can in the courts to convince a court to declare what this governor has done to be in violation of our constitutional rights, to stop him from continuing to do it, and to strike it down. So those are the actions that we take in court to try to stop an executive order and to have it struck down. So we're taking the appropriate legal actions. Regrettably, we lost in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. As you know, we're trying to get it up into the United States Supreme Court. We're happy that Justice Alito has ordered the governor to respond to our application to stay, which is a request to stop the enforcement of the order pending the determination by the United States Supreme Court on the larger issue that we have presented. So we're doing all we can.
Elections have consequences, and back when we had 3 Supreme Court justices up for the last time that we had 3 openings was King George was able to fill them, I understand, because he had the legal authority to do so. And who did we put in there? Look at their record, look at their background, look at their party affiliation. Elections have consequences, and as soon as people realize that, maybe they'll do something about it, because we have term limits coming up in November if people exercise them. Again, a republic if we can keep it.
You're exactly right, Richard, and elections do have consequences. And you're referring
me
to
being right $5 to buy your coffee at Starbucks. So, but thank you for what you do. God bless you, and keep up the good work. Later.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Appreciate that, Richard from Mechanicsburg, calling the show and giving us the benefit of his wisdom. And you know, he reminds us that elections do have consequences. And we may have talked about this before, but judicial elections are not the most energetic and dynamic and exciting elections. You know, we all get revved up for the presidential elections every 4 years. That generates the highest turnout. And it's something we as voters can easily identify with. We see Hillary Clinton on television. We see Donald Trump or Joe Biden on television. We hear them talk about their campaigns, talk about their policies. They spar. They go back and forth. We understand the issues that they're discussing. We understand health care. We understand taxes. We understand national security. It's something that we're typically often thinking about. But judicial elections are much more difficult. They're not like that at all. We often don't know who our judges are. They don't talk about taxes, increasing them or lowering them, or they don't talk about whether or not we should go to war in Iraq or not. So it's harder for us to know what they're doing and what they stand for and what they're all about. But my goodness, do they have power? And we have just experienced that in our particular case. Wow, it can be stunning to be on the receiving end of a judicial order like the one we got in our case. So I think perhaps the next judicial elections, I think perhaps more attention will be paid to those races because of how public how public the governor's executive orders on closing businesses and his stay-at-home order have been. It's been the biggest thing that's happened to probably all of us in our lifetimes, I would think. You know, none of us, or very, very few of us, have gone through the Great Depression, and I think that's as close as we can get to a similar experience economically. Although it's not the same because of the massive bailout that businesses and individuals are getting through unemployment compensation, through the PPL loan to small businesses and others, none of which occurred during the Great Depression. So I'll have to kind of walk that back a little bit. I guess we're all kind of being buffered right now by government bailouts, essentially. But there will come a day when the bill comes due, and we're borrowing and printing the money. At least the federal government is borrowing and printing, and the state government. Well, Governor Wolf just recently announced there's a $5 billion budget deficit. And Pennsylvania can't print money, unlike the federal government. So how are we going to repay that? So the check will come due for all of this. The $5 to $6 billion on UC claims. That's going to have to be paid back. And so there is a lot of financial and fiscal hardship coming down the road, even though many of us may not have experienced it quite yet because of the loans and the UC. We shall see how that develops. We're starting to hear stories of businesses closing down, and my fear is it will only get worse. Well, that's all the time we have today for the Marc Scaringi Show. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our special guest, State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale. Wish him Godspeed in his audit. And tune in every Saturday at 1 o'clock here on WHB 580 and WEJS out of Williamsport. Thanks for listening.